the record button. There we go. We're off. Excellent. Good evening. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the session. We've got more people arriving. Hold on, let me just let them in as well. Good evening.
Hi, everybody. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. We'll wait until, because we're still a minute to go. Well, we've just clicked over at 7 o'clock, but should we give people another minute, Guy, just in case we've got...
I think so. I think so. They're just clearly tossing up between watching us and watching the One Show. So let's give those that have made the right choice a moment or two to log on, accepting, you know, a few Wi-Fi failures. But yeah, all good. Welcome, everybody. That's great. What a lovely crowd.
Good. We've got more and more people joining. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Those of you who are just coming into the meeting room, thank you for joining this evening. Luke, good to see you. How are you doing, Luke?
Good, thanks, Justin. How are you?
Good. Yeah, really well. Thanks. Thanks for joining us this evening.
Of course.
It's always good doing these things in January when it's cold, isn't it? I remember I've done a few of these things when it's been warm summer evenings when there's football on, and you're thinking there is precisely zero chance of anybody turning up, including me. So well done to all of you that have made it, and thank you. So, we've got one more pops in there, Justin, and then shall we hit go?
Yeah, let's go. Yeah.
Right. So, welcome everybody. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Guy Deeming. I'm an orthodontist in the Northeast, and I'm one of the orthodontic PCLs at Portman Dentex. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and it's a great pleasure to have been invited to be involved with this evening's session with Justin Lee. Many of you will know Justin as the founder of Focus for Growth, which is a sales and leadership organization with a specialist interest in the dental market. He's written a number of fantastic books, which I have read, and they're excellent. They are succinct and to the point and well worth looking out for. I'm sure Justin wouldn't mind sending or putting a link out there or sending it around afterwards, but well worth a read. But he's been involved with training thousands of professionals in the dental and medical sector over many, many years. And there's a huge and comprehensive CV, including work for the BDA, the BACD, FMC, lots and lots of other things. And he also runs the Accelerator program alongside some other big hitters in the dental market. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Justin, who's going to talk to us this evening on the webinar entitled Transforming Communication with Patients to Increase Case Acceptance. And there's some learning objectives here around understanding patients and team leaders' needs, teams' needs, connecting with your patients, asking for commitment, and understanding how best to communicate. And I think those are really great objectives. And if we even touch the sides on those, we'll be doing fantastically well. So the idea for this evening is that Justin's going to talk to us for about 45 minutes or thereabouts. Please put questions in the Q&A box or the chat box. I will monitor both of those, so don't be too precious about it. And for the end of the evening, we'll have a Q&A session. Feel free to contribute to that. And yeah, looking very much forward to hearing what Justin has to say for us tonight. So without further ado, Justin, thank you for joining us.
Guy, thanks so much for the excellent introduction. I hope I can live up to that really nice message. Thank you. I really appreciate it. There are still people joining us. So first and foremost, thanks everybody for joining us this evening and investing an hour of your time. Before I get started, let's just do a couple of things. The first is I've just put a message into the chat box. I've just realized there isn't a Q&A and a chat box. There's only a chat box. So we'll just use that, if that's okay. If I can ask you, if you're coming on and you've got any background noise, please would you kind of mute yourself so that we don't disturb the other people on the webinar this evening. And there is, I'm sure you've all been used to using Zoom as a kind of legacy from COVID, but just on the menu bar on Zoom, you'll see that there's the chat box, which I've just put a message in just to say, here's the chat stroke Q&A box. So do feel free to either put messages or questions in there. We won't take them as we go along because we want to get through the content, and then Guy and I will have a conversation with you about questions, comments or feedback at the end of today's session. There's also the reactions button. I don't know if anybody's seen the reactions button, so you can do all sorts of things in there. If you're feeling generous, you can give a round of applause, you can put a heart, you can do all sorts. And when we come to the end of the Q&A, if anybody would like to either give some comments or you'd like to ask a question, then we'll also invite you to raise your hand if you're feeling brave this evening. So that's the kind of technicalities. Let's get on with this evening's session. Thanks again, as I say, for joining me. This evening's session really is an opportunity to create some thinking space. I'm a big fan of thinking space because we don't get enough of it. Very often what we'll find is that we are almost in a race day to day to see your patients. For me, it's seeing clients and customers, to work on the other priorities within your business, to be leading your teams, to be working on pathways, all the different tasks that you have to complete. And what that means is that we end up in this this kind of compressed time space where we don't have the clear thinking space. And clear thinking space is where we start to make improvements in practice, make improvements in your business so that things start to change. And really, a big part of what I do is helping people to get that thinking space and to create growth opportunities within your practices. And that's really what we want to talk about this evening. We have got a bit of noise in the background. I will keep an eye. Guy's able to mute people as well, so Guy will keep an eye on that. Thank you, everybody. But if you don't mind muting yourself when you come on, that'd be great. So Guy's already talked about our outcomes, transforming communication with patients with a view specifically to increase case acceptance where it's appropriate, where it's optimal for the patient and for your practice. We'll look at how to understand patient needs. I'm just going to mute somebody. There we go. How to understand patients and team members' needs, how to connect treatment options with those needs once you understand them, how to ask for commitment, and then understanding a communication model that hopefully you're going to find really useful to increase relevance and value to your patients. So Guy did a great introduction for me, so I won't have to go through this. One of the things I will just talk about is the fact that during my career, as I started my career, I don't know if many people know this, as a dental technician. So I originally was in dentistry, then I moved into sales management, business leadership, inside and outside of dentistry. And the one thing that I noticed throughout my career in myself and the teams that I led was that over time, it's really easy for people to start to drift in terms of performance, in terms of engagement, in terms of positivity. And actually, there are some really simple things that we can do just to reset and recalibrate ourselves and our teams so that we increase engagement, we improve performance, and that leads to better results and more consistent application in our work. And that's really the area that I like to focus in on with clients. It's the simple things, foundational things that really make the difference. And since I've been working for myself the last kind of 7 years, I wanted to really start to develop these models and concepts into greater depth so that it would be more useful for clients. And that's where the books came from, really, was the idea that we could deep dive into some of these concepts and give you some practical, actionable advice that you can then take away and work on yourself. And that's kind of what we'll talk about this evening. So first things first, I'd love to just start our session this evening with a poll. So I have a poll that I have created. I'm just going to launch that and ask you just to have a look at it and just select one of these items from the poll. What I'm keen to understand is, what is your or your team's biggest challenge when you think about patient consultations? And I'm not really thinking about the clinical element, because that's something you deal with in practice. It's more around the communication element. So is it discussing prices for treatment options? Is it asking for commitment to start treatment, especially if it is a private treatment plan that you're looking at? Is it articulating benefits of treatment with you and your practice? Is it understanding what your patient really needs or wants from treatment? Or is it discussing private treatment instead of NHS, where you're trying to give people this additional option? So to just click on the one that for you is the most predominant challenge that you would say is faced either by you or in your practice. And if there's something else, that actually you think, Justin, you've missed this, just click on the something else and then just put that in the chat, and I will I'll look to kind of include that or address that as we go through tonight's session. So we have with 60% of you have voted. I'll just give you another minute to vote and then I'll wrap it up. So yeah, if you haven't seen it yet, just click on the one key challenge that you find is most prevalent for you in your practice this year, either you or your team, if that's most appropriate. Okay, good. Thank you, everybody. We've got 70% of you have voted. That's good enough for me. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate that. Let me share the results with you. So what we've got number one is discussing private treatment instead of NHS. That's the most predominant one. That's interesting. We'll talk a bit about that tonight. We've got number two, and 35% of you is asking for commitment to start treatment. That's a really common challenge with a lot of practices that I work with, so thank you for that. Next, third place at 13% is discussing prices for treatment options. That's really, really useful, thank you. Fourth is articulating benefits of treatment with your practice, with you, and then the final one is understanding patients' needs. Okay, thank you, that's great. So a really good selection there of kind of challenges within practice, which we'll look to address as we go through tonight's session. I was prepared for this because I asked that question a lot in different webinars that I run. And here's what normally comes up. So we've got some commonality with the general theme that I usually talk to people about, and then we've got some differences this evening. So the number one thing that normally comes up is asking for commitment to start treatment. That was number 2 tonight. So that's interesting. Second thing that normally comes up is understanding patients' needs, because a lot of the time it can feel like you're trying to mind read when you're having a conversation with a patient. And then third is articulating the benefits of treatment with your practice or with you as a clinician. So they're the top 3 that usually come up. Tonight we've got discussing private treatment options instead of NHS, which is actually number 1. So hopefully as we go through tonight's session, you can start to take some of the themes and ideas from this session and think about how they apply to that as a key challenge. So let's talk a bit about the challenges, and then we'll go to how we resolve and solve those challenges. So the 3 key challenges, and you'll notice I've reordered them here, and I've reordered them because it's in this order that we have to address them. So the first challenge is understanding patients' needs. Until we understand what the patient needs, it's really difficult to articulate what the benefits are of having treatment with you as a clinician or your practice, because really we want to try and understand how we connect and join up the dots for the patient, rather than just giving them a list of reasons why they should start to consider your practice or your treatment plan. And then the third, once you've got those 2 foundations in place, you understand what the patient needs, you can articulate benefits that are relevant to them, then it makes asking for commitment much more straightforward and it feels more natural. So we have to get those 3 things in the right order. But if we don't understand the challenges, then sometimes we can fall into the trap of repeating them. So just a bit about each of the challenges could be useful for context. And in a lot of the work I do with practice teams, with the clients that I work with, and it's interesting, I work inside and outside of dentistry. And what I notice is that this is the number 1 challenge for a lot of business teams, where actually it's about taking the time to ask the right questions and then listen to patients or customers, because if that doesn't happen and the patient or the customer doesn't have a chance to express their needs and talk about what their priorities are, maybe what some of their reservations are, if they don't have the chance to articulate that, then there's a piece missing to the puzzle. They don't have the chance to process these things, and so they then don't guide themselves through their own decision-making journey. And I'll share a bit more about that with you shortly. The second challenge, of course, is articulating benefits of treatment with you or your practice, or if it's a business, in the business context with that business. And many clinicians and people in businesses that know what they're doing, they're experts in their field, will find it really comfortable to talk about treatment. But if they haven't taken that first step and understood what their patient or customer really needs, then the presentation of treatment options or solutions doesn't seem tailored or relevant. So the patient or the customer's kind of sitting there thinking, yeah, it sounds okay, but they're not able to say what I'm really looking for is. And if we haven't asked the question, we just can't join up the dots for them. And then, of course, thirdly, asking for commitment to start treatment becomes a challenge, because if we don't understand what the patients really need, then we can find ourselves in this situation where we inadvertently can perhaps talk too much and sometimes feel like we are pitching treatments, and nobody likes that feeling. It's a really uncomfortable feeling. And so when you've been in that situation where perhaps that is how you feel during the conversation, you don't then feel confident to ask for commitment, because there's this gap in what you've explained to the patient and the response that you get from them. We'll talk a bit about how to overcome that as we go through the rest of the session. So I really like this diagram. It's so useful for us to think about. There's lots of things that we think, you think as clinicians, for me, in my role, that I think are important for my clients to know, and for you will think for your patients need to know. But actually, there's only a certain amount that interests them. And there are certain things that absolutely have to be part of the conversation with a patient, but there are other things that are superfluous. And what we have to figure out as we go through the conversation with the patient, and some of it's trial and error, some of it is actually just really starting to tune into the patient and listen more carefully to what they're saying is important. And we want to find this overlap in the Venn diagram, which is what's relevant to the patient, what they need to know and what they're interested to know. It's really important that we try and get to that sweet spot really in the information. And I like to think about the patient journey and the decision-making steps that the patient takes alongside the stages of the conversation that we might have in a consultation. And I'll talk you through this because it's quite relevant for patients and clinicians. It's also relevant in business with customers as well. It's also interesting when you think about team members and the decisions that they start to make. So normally with a conversation with a patient, they may start that consultation or the conversation unaware that there is another option beyond what they've either already thought of, or if they're coming in and they are thinking it's a routine appointment, then they're perhaps not aware that actually there are other options available to them. And a lot of what you will do in practice is be prepared, have the right information, make sure that you've looked at the patient's notes, make sure that you understand somewhat about the patient so that you can start that conversation informed. And what we want to do really is start to get the patient's attention to an opportunity or an option for change. And one of the ways that we can use that attention is to create insights. So one of the most effective ways to create insights is to use digital. So when we start to show patients, either an intraoral image or a scan of their own teeth, then they'll start to notice things that they perhaps wouldn't have noticed before. And when we do that, we share those insights, and we're really getting the patient to see something they couldn't see before. Then what happens is they move from just being attentive to being interested. So they kind of lean in. I'm interested that there might be something else here that could really help. And that's the point at which it's really easy to start talking about treatment. So the patient says, I'm interested, what could I do about that? Or how could you help me with this? And it's a bit of a red herring. It's a bit of a trap. If we start to talk too much about treatment options at that stage, the patient goes from being interested to tuned out very quickly. When the patient shows interest, that's the point at which we need to really understand, okay, they might be interested, but what are they really looking for? What do they need from treatment to feel like it's going to be the right thing for them? So asking questions, listening carefully, really important at that stage. And the reason that that's so important is, as well as helping you to understand what that patient really needs from treatment, it also helps the patient to make that journey in processing for themselves, and they move from just being interested to having a desire to change. And it's when a patient has a desire to change that we should start to talk about solutions and treatment options. And that's the kind of key step. If we get that piece right, everything makes much more sense for the patient, feels much more natural for you as a clinician in the conversation. And of course, once you've talked about the treatment solution to a patient who actually is interested in changing, has a desire to change, then they're much more likely to want to take action. Next step. Okay, what does the next step look like? And that's a point at which you can start to talk about treatment proposals, how treatment plans work, and confirming the details, because the patient says, yes, this is something I'd like to go ahead with. But interestingly, even when you talk about treatment plans and proposals, in order to get a patient to want to start treatment, sign up to treatment, the final thing we have to do is initiate some form of commitment. And doing that really helps the patient to say, yes, this is something I want to do, and yes, I'm committed to doing it to the point where I'll schedule some time, or I'll pay a deposit, or I may do both. And if we don't do that final step of initiating, then we'll find that a lot of patients will kind of go away and think about it, and then before you know it, you kind of really difficult to keep track on who's had what information, where they are in the process. So we really want to initiate as that final step. But of course, what we're all looking for is to increase loyalty from patients or customers, and we do that through a process of reflection. So regularly stopping and thinking about the communication, the types of questions you're asking, the way in which you're engaging patients, just to make sure that you're continually meeting the needs of the different types of patients that visit you in practice. So that's the journey as I like to kind of lay it out and think about it from the patient's perspective, alongside the stages of the consultation and communicating effectively. And really we have to think about, whether it's through an intraoral camera, as I say, or a scan, but starting to think about how we help patients to see the difference that they can make to their dentition, because if they can't see it, if they can't acknowledge the change that they want, then it's really difficult to actually initiate that change. So you can't change what you don't acknowledge, and awareness is always the first step to change for us and for our patients. So from the book, in the book we lay out this model, and you'll see, I talked about it in a linear kind of step-by-step process. I like to think of it as a cycle. So I like to think about each conversation as being a cycle with a patient, because we are continually repeating that cycle, improving the communication, and really starting to evolve the relationship with the patient through a model like this. And you'll see, relationships are at the heart of our cycle. We make sure that we feel prepared. We share some insights, whether that's digitally or otherwise. We ask about their needs. We then talk about a solution, we make a proposal, and then we initiate some action, and then we reflect and continually improve. And you'll see that's the cycle. It's really, once you get it implemented and embedded into your consultations, it's really effective in being able to develop that value with a patient. So one thing that I always remind myself of, it's a lesson I learned a couple of times, at least in my career, was when I was first in sales and I was selling into dental practices and dentists and laboratories, was that as we think about, this for me is a consultative model in terms of communication. And what that means is that a lot of the work that we do is question-led, so it's inquiry, it's being curious, it's asking good questions. And the same is true in leadership. When we're leading teams, coaching people, asking about their motivations, and then meeting those motivations with the right expectations, it's really important. And it's a lesson I've learned a number of times throughout my career, that when we think about commitment from patients, commitment from our teams, commitment from customers, stakeholders, commitment has to be pulled. Really difficult to push someone into doing something, and nobody really wants to do that. But commitment being pulled is a really good analogy for how we think about having those conversations with our team members and our patients. So we talked about the 3 challenges. Let's talk a bit about how we overcome these challenges. So first step was understanding patients' needs. So this on our model, this fits here over in we call it the needs discovery stage. So really important that we learn to listen to patients more intently. And I love this analogy, because it kind of really helps you to remember, that listen and silent are made up of the same letters. You cannot do one without doing the other. And a big challenge that we have in communication is this point that most people will be listening to reply rather than listening to understand. And the more we know about the practice, the treatment, patients, the more tempting it is to kind of sit there while the patient might be talking, ready to kind of tell them what we already think. And actually we should start to create a bit more space, start to create moments of silence, because in those moments of silence we get better understanding of the patient and what they're really trying to articulate and understand for themselves very often, but it helps us to understand them as well. So once we learn to listen, and listening is a skill we need to develop over time, then we have to start to think about the types of questions that we ask, so that we can really help the patient to process their thinking, but also share with us what's most important for them as they start to consider treatment. And there are 3 types of questions that I like to kind of explain. The first is an open question. So open questions are those questions that get people talking very naturally, and we ask the right framed question and it gets the right information, helps people to process that information too. The second type of question is a probing question. So we may have asked an open question of a patient. We perhaps have some information, but we think there's more there for us to discover, and we might probe and just ask another follow-up question that helps that patient to process the information even further. And then the third type of question is a closed question. And closed questions, it's really interesting. A lot of the work I do as a coach, what I've discovered is that closed questions come really naturally to people. So unless you're really conscious of the questions you ask, you'll find that you and your teams will be asking a lot of closed questions. And the challenge with closed questions is that they tend to be met with either a yes or a no. And if you're trying to understand what someone's really looking for from treatment, and you're asking closed questions, you'll just be getting a lot of yeses and nos, and that can stifle the amount of information that you receive. So really have to think about what types of questions we ask and when and where we ask them. And I like to think of these alongside that patient journey that we mentioned, where right at the early stages of the conversation, we should be asking open questions to get the patient talking. There's lots of ways to ask open questions. We should be probing and just getting below the surface with the patient throughout the needs discovery and those solution stage. And then towards the end of the process, when we are just trying to sense check if this is something the patient would like to go ahead with, that's when we would ask a closed question to get commitment and to help the patient to discuss next steps. So really simple way of thinking about what types of questions we ask where. And one thing that we do on our programs is really start to unpack what are the types of questions that we should be asking. And we think about different types of treatment options, different types of patient situations, and really start to create a guide for the types of questions that we know are going to really help the patient to process the information and to help us to understand what is it they're really looking for from treatment, so that as you start the discussion about treatment options, you're talking to the patient about something that's really tailored and relevant for them. So that's the first step, is really understanding questions and listening, and that really helps you to better understand your patient's needs. So second area, once we've understood what the patient's needs are and they've explained that to us, that is when we should start to think about, okay, how do we now articulate the benefits of treatment linked to what the patient has told us they need? Because that now becomes the gateway to being able to be as relevant as we can to the patient. So this part of our process is, we call it the solutions discussion. And we have to recognize this is so true, that if we don't understand and articulate the value that we bring in our interactions to whether it's patients or customers or even other people in the business, then what you'll find is that cost is always the greater priority. Because when people don't understand the value, they almost go to the lowest common denominator, which of course is cost or price. So how much is that going to cost? And then they'll start to compare price if they think everything has the same value. So we have to be able to really understand the value that we can create for patients. And what it means for patients is that in terms of how we articulate value, is to think about three things. And you may have seen these in the past, so hopefully it's a good refresher for you. If you haven't, it might be a new distinction. So the first thing is the features. So to think about features of what you provide. And I've got an example coming up for you on this. Then we think about advantages. So advantages are how something is better. And then the final thing is the benefits, the value that creates for that patient. So, features are thought of really as trivial. We want to do things that are more important. Important are advantages. How's this better than something else? It might be, how's this better than doing nothing? It might be, how is one treatment option advantageous to another? It may be how your clinic is advantageous over another, for example, whether that's a specialism or otherwise. And then the benefit is, how does that relate to that patient and the need they said they had in the conversation that you'd had with them before? And if you start to just join up the dots for your patient like this, it just makes everything you talk about much more tailored and relevant. And I like to plot it on, we call this a FAB-SOL document. So you'll see feature, advantage, benefit is the FAB. and SOL is the solution, the need of the patients that this satisfies. And we spend some time on different treatment options, mapping these out as we go through different workbooks and workshops. And this is one that was mapped out with a group that I worked with fairly recently. So we looked at specifically the clear aligners. So we were saying from a clear aligner perspective, what would we kind of talk to a patient about? So a feature of a clear aligner is that it's a clear material. Okay, but the advantage is that it's then less noticeable, say, than brackets or wires. The benefit for the patient could be, there could be multiple benefits, but one of them could be that the patient doesn't feel so self-conscious. And the solution might be that that patient wanted to keep treatment discreet. They didn't want, to be overtly having, orthodontic treatment. They wanted to keep that to themselves. So you can see how this starts to join up. I won't go through all of these, but it's probably worth having a look at removable appliances as well. So the feature of clear aligners being removable is that it makes meal times easier and more comfortable. It means that they can still eat and drink normally. And it also means that they don't have to interrupt their social life. So if they are conscious about treatment, they've got a way to manage that and manage it within their social life and then wider life experience as they go through treatment. And you can see as we start to go through each of these different features that actually the advantage, the benefit, and the solution for the patient actually is quite different from what you might think was the original feature. And actually this is what patients are really thinking about as we start to talk to them about different treatment options. They don't necessarily want the technicality or the feature. They really want to understand, so what does that mean for me? And being able to join up the dots like this really helps you to become more relevant. So that's understanding how to articulate benefits of treatment. And actually some of this work is quite straightforward. Once you map it out and you're clear on it, it can be really useful. Even, I've had clients even create patient guides around this type of information because it just speaks to what the patient's really looking for from treatment and kind of simplifies some of those key messages. And then the third area that we'll talk about this evening is asking for commitment. So how do we ask for commitment? Hopefully you're starting to see that as we join the dots up, by understanding your patient, by listening carefully, by asking really good questions, by then being able to understand, this is what the patient's told me, I can now join up the treatment solution that I think is most optimal. It may be a couple of options, and we join those up to what the patient said they're looking for. You're so much clearer in the communication that when it comes to this stage, what we call proposal agreement, actually you feel more confident to make a recommendation to the patient, and the patient feels more connected to the recommendation as well. So how do we do that? I really like the idea of what we call pre-commitment. So before you go into a full proposal or a treatment proposal, it's almost a check-in with the patient, and we call it this pre-commitment question. And the pre-commitment question is something along the lines of, is there anything else we need to cover before we discuss the treatment proposal? And really what the aim of this question is to give the patient some thinking space and to sense check that what we've talked about so far makes sense to them and that they're ready now to talk about, how does treatment work or what does a proposal for treatment look like? And that would include the price or investment that's required. And the great thing about this question is that it's really natural and easy to ask, but it also allows the patient, if there is something that is on their mind that they haven't had the chance to say, but they kind of feel like they need to say it. It might be an objection, it might be another question, but this pre-commitment question will allow the patient to say it. And that really does help you to then feel more confident in being able to kind of move the patient through those decision-making stages. It's a really simple, really natural question. And this is my variation of it, but you could develop your own that would allow you to feel, really confident to ask this every time. So that's the third point. I'm always conscious that, we attend a lot of workshops. I'm sure you're like me. I do a lot of personal development, and I listen to a lot of things. I'm sure that as you've gone through tonight's session, there's lots of things kind of occurring to you and bubbling away. I love this phrase that enthusiasm has a half-life. So tonight you'll be thinking, God, there's some great stuff there. I'm definitely going to do that tomorrow, right? And then you're going to go to sleep tonight, and you're going to travel to work tomorrow, and all of that enthusiasm will perhaps fizzle away. So I just encourage you now just to think about maybe 2 or 3 things from tonight's webinar that you think, yeah, there's 2 or 3 things there that I can really grasp and pick up and use. So just maybe make a note to yourself and think about, okay, how am I going to hold myself accountable to really do this going forward? Because that's where the change really makes an impact, hopefully a positive impact for you and your patients and your team. So key actions to focus on from this session. I'll just give you a moment to think about those. And there's a few other slides I want to cover with you before we go to Q&A, but just give you a moment to reflect on that. If you want to go one step further in your commitment, then you feel free to put your key actions or takeaways into the chat box. That would be even better. So you've got that as an option. Feel free to do that. I'm sure that your colleagues will be pleased to hear that as well, because there's a few ways in which we process and learn. One is through sessions like this where you're listening to me jabber on. Another is in actually making that kind of journey from this is what I've heard to, okay, this is what I can do, and this is what I'll do about it. That's another step in learning. And then third one for this evening's webinar is also hearing what other people have gained from the session and what they're prepared to do. So it's like a third element. It's like a secret weapon for learning. So feel free to drop those in the chat if you want to share that with other people. And feel free to do that in the background throughout this next step as well. Okay. A few other things. So tonight is a taster. Huge thanks to Caroline for setting up tonight's session. Huge thanks to Guy for joining me and hosting. I really appreciate it. So we have this program called Practice Growth Academy. And the whole idea of the Practice Growth Academy is that we bring clinicians together and share, deep dives into these different elements of communication and really help them to map out what changes they want to make in order to improve case acceptance, improve communication with patients, and fuel growth in practice. And the way that we run these academies is that we have this tool I call a patient experience scorecard, and it's a diagnostic tool that is a series of statements that you can start to measure yourself against. When you've gone through that process, you'll get a personal development report with some recommendations about how you could improve communication with patients. Once we've done that, we then invite you to join our 2-day training and coaching workshop. And as part of those 2 days, we really deep dive into all of the different elements of our Inspire model. We talk about how to handle price inquiries, how to build confidence in talking about prices with patients, how to really kind of start to map out your own consultation and how you can best use the models and the process. We talk about how to handle objections, different types of objections. We do some work in there about coaching and coaching yourself, building development plans. It's a really comprehensive 2-day training workshop. And we also include what we call accountability partners. So we invite you to work with another person as part of the workshop so that you've got one other person that you can kind of keep connected with outside of just the 2 days. And there's a lot of practice sessions and really kind of taking the time to go deep into how you need to develop your own models of communication. We obviously we provide books, copies of the book, Inspire, Consult, Sell, and there is an online program that has all of the different modules in video form so that you can go back and replay or re-look at any of the content that you cover throughout the 2 days. We have this document called the Inspire Toolkit, which is like an electronic document that allows you to capture your plans and communicate them really easily with your colleagues. And then we follow up about 3 weeks after the course with a 90-minute coaching web class, a bit like tonight's session, but more interactive, more kind of question-led, where people get the chance to come back and share what's working, perhaps share some of the ongoing challenges and get some coaching and ideas. And then beyond that, I run all sorts of different kind of mastermind workshops and groups. So there's lots of options beyond it. But if anybody is interested in the patient experience scorecard, I will share this resource with you this evening. I'll put it in the chat in a second. You can look at the scorecard and go through that. It's a free resource to start your journey today. And I've got an example of the Inspire Toolkit. This is all of the different documents that we go through as we work through the 2-day course together. So we really go deep into the different elements of how to improve communication with your patients, especially in this area. And we, in particular for this group, we really want to specialize in the orthodontic area. So look specifically for what does it take for orthodontists, orthodontic therapists to really start to build out this model. So if what we've covered tonight has kind of stimulated some interest, and if you are interested in a practice growth workshop, which would be exclusive for Portman Dentex orthodontists and orthodontic therapists this year, we'd love to set something up in 2025. Please feel free to contact. You can contact me directly if you want, but Caroline, if you could contact Caroline and register your interest, that would be excellent. You see my contact details are on the screen as well. I'm very open to you contacting me directly if you prefer that. But otherwise, if it's something that you are interested in, please register your interest with Caroline. And we've been running this orthodontic treatment survey just to try and understand a bit more about what you might be looking for from communication in your clinics and within your roles. So we'll circulate that after today's session as well, because that's going to give us hopefully information that you will find useful, and we can share those headline results back with you after we've collated all the results as well. Okay, I've talked for about 35-40 minutes, so that's good. We've got some great comments in the chat. So thank you for your comments so far. And Carly said, will the recording be available? Yes, you'll get the recording. I'm also happy to share the slides as well, so you'll get access to the recording and the slides. And we've got some great comments coming in as well. But I'll pause for a second, stop the sharing, and Guy and I will kind of handle some questions and feedback from you from here.
Thank you so much, Justin. That was
Pleasure.
A fabulous introduction, I think, to what is an incredibly important topic. And I've made a few kind of comments as I've gone through here. The FabSol sheet, I think, is a really, really good idea to give that conversation some structure. And I think we all struggle with that. And one of the things that really struck me listening to you was really that reflection that I've often had, that when talking to colleagues, that it's this awkwardness, this slight Britishness we have when we engage with any of these topics. And it always struck me, and advice to my team and friends and colleagues is, patients are coming to you because they want you to help them. And you shouldn't pull back, therefore, from talking to them about how you can benefit them. And you're not selling them something they didn't want. You're not knocking on their door trying to sell them double glazing. You're nurturing that pilot light of enthusiasm, of interest, and dare I say it, need they have. Because what they're really doing is they've identified a need for them to have you help them. And our job is then to facilitate that, make it easier for them, to make a path of least resistance for them. And I think so often we stifle that pilot light by talking about features that are not relevant or making it too difficult. And one of the things that always strikes me is this NHS private conversion piece. And there's a couple of things around that I always hear, is that we can't talk to NHS patients about private. It's not ethical. Well, I would argue the opposite, actually. I always have, and I'd be interested in your view on this, because I'm sure you've heard this, but it's actually not ethical to not offer them choice. And choice is imperative, and it's the patient's choice. It's not your choice to give them the choice. And I don't know if you've got any kind of comments on that, particularly that NHS conversion piece, on how people can approach that and overcoming that innate Britishness or NHS apologist position that I think some of us are at risk of adopting.
Yeah, I completely agree, Guy. I mean, one of the GDC regulations, I think it's guidelines, GDC guideline 2, is that it's incumbent on dentists to give the patient access to all of the clinical options available to them, and that includes private options. So it's actually part of GDC guidelines. It's kind of incumbent on clinicians to do that. I think the other thing to remember is that if the conversation is as you've described it, the patient has this, I love the idea of the pilot light, right? And the idea is that we can help nurture that pilot light and grow the enthusiasm if that's what the patient wants. And we do that through questions, through listening, through understanding, through dialogue and natural conversation that allows the patient to say, let's say it's NHS, and they say, well, actually, I don't really want to wait, or I don't want my child to wait. And then we can start to explore that. Okay, so what are you considering then? And the patient might say, well, tell me how I can get treatment more quickly, or how can I get a different type of treatment that means we don't have to wait. And all of a sudden you can open up that dialogue, and the patient is the one driving the agenda. It's not you selling them or trying to force them into anything they don't want. Actually, what you're doing is facilitating exactly what they want. I love the way that you think about it and describe it, Guy. It's also being comfortable in those conversations, because if you are awkward in any way, shape, or form, if you feel defensive or pressured, the patient senses that, because that's how communication works. So this is such an important skill to practice, so that you become more confident and comfortable in those conversations. And when the patient feels that you're confident and comfortable when you're having the conversation, you will allow them to feel the same. It's so important that we work on this.
Yeah, I agree. And that confidence is that ability to look the patients directly in the eye and have a very honest, candid conversation with them. And that's all this is about. And I think as Justin's introduction tonight and as the extended course will demonstrate, it's not about following the scripts. It's about finding your own way through this conversation and through this opportunity. This is about facilitating not the growth of your business, but the best interests of patients who want to access the very best that they can for them or their family or their kids. And the other thing that you picked up on, you mentioned, Justin, which I think is so relevant, is it's almost that second step thing, isn't it? It's like we all come on these things and we get excited and we do this and we think, I'm going to do all of this stuff. And then by the time you get to Monday morning, it's just not quite the same vibe. And I think there's a couple of things about that. The first thing is that sometimes that big change is too big. You haven't got to do everything at once. You can take smaller steps. So if the first step is too big, take smaller steps, right? But the second thing, and I think this goes back to your extended course thing, Justin, this is kind of a sales pitch, but we're here because we want to be sold to, right? Because we need help, we need support. The idea is that actually, if you give yourself a structure, if you give yourself a program to follow, rather than just turn up to one session and then disappear and hope you can do it yourself, we need help. We need somebody to support us. And actually, we to some degree need that accountability to help us make the changes that we need to. And that's for us and for our teams. And do remember to bring your teams along for this. But I think the chance of succeeding in making a change in how you approach this problem is much, much higher with the support of others, and that's your team, but also some external help, whether that's Justin, who's obviously the best, but also other programs are available, of course. But Justin's obviously developed this fantastic program for dentistry and for orthodontics in particular, which I think is such an opportunity for us to develop our businesses and our personal practices. So beware the second step, really.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Guy. I think the other element to it is that changing anything, you'll all know this from working in practice, changing anything requires you to practice. And so hearing something for the first time is useful, because it makes you aware that you want to change something. Actually going from hearing it, learning it, applying it, and then applying it in a way that you feel confident and comfortable to apply over and over again, that's really useful to get that kind of safe environment to practice. Because I always had the idea that practicing on customers or practicing on patients is quite difficult. It's okay when you're training and learning, because that's a big part of how you develop. But as we start to think about these communication skills alongside the clinical skills, actually having that environment where you can kind of take your foot off the clinical gas, as it were, and go, I just want to focus in on my communication, and get some space where you can do that with another clinician who perhaps is going through the same learning process, so you don't have the pressure. It just feels really kind of easy and natural to be making those mistakes, picking yourself up, starting it again, and just going over and over it again. In a couple of days, it's surprising how many, and the way that we run the program is that we break it down into elements, and we start with the first step, practice that as a conversation. Then we introduce the next step, and we practice the first and the second steps together. and we might need to run through that a couple of times. Then we introduce the third step, and then you practice the first, second, and third step together. So it really does become like building muscle, and you build this communication muscle throughout the course of the 2 days. So by the end of it, you've probably rehearsed, I don't know, at least 10 different patient conversations. So you start to feel much more confident to make that change and embed it in practice, rather than listening to something once and trying to implement. That's quite challenging. I've had that experience myself. So hopefully that's useful as context for how we help you develop this through the program.
And it's really saying that one size doesn't fit all, isn't it? I mean, you can't have one approach for every patient, and equally on one training approach doesn't work for every individual. And the problems I see, either colleagues who may be less successful in this area, but also in the clinical arena, the colleagues that seem to attract the most patient-related hassle are the ones that lack the confidence. That's not about arrogance, and it's not about, chest beating. It's simply about communicating effectively and empathetically, so that you're recognizing the patient communication need, and you're kind of molding your approach to suit them, rather than being a one size fits all, my way or the highway, preaching from the pulpit type individual, which might hit the mark for 3 out of 10, but the 7 out of 10 who are either going to be dismissive, wound up, or or other to your approach. And that chameleon aspect. And the other thing I've made a note here is, and again you allude to it, Justin, is that listening.
Yes.
And those magic minutes, whether that's when you're dealing with a patient challenge or a complaint, dare I say it, but also in this much more positive conversation, just shut up, to sit there and listen, even if you're in a rush.
Yeah.
The perception that the patient will have that you've got time and you're listening, even if you haven't, is immensely valuable in those early moments of that relationship.
Yeah.
Just to get it all off their chest, because that will allow you time to calibrate yourself against their needs and their personalities, and dare I say it, their trigger and touch points. I've seen 72 other orthodontists. Okay. Mental note. You get the idea. So when in doubt, shut up and listen.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's useful for your team conversations as well. When your team perhaps sometimes they just need someone to listen. Very often a patient just needs someone to listen, and creating that space, if you get used to doing it and it becomes something that's a skill you've cultivated, it becomes quite natural for you to listen first. And you'll be surprised at what happens when you do lead with listening and curiosity and questions. You get deeper relationships, you get better understanding, and more naturally, people will want to, make the right choice, to whether it's to go into treatment or to work for you longer or be more loyal to your practice. It's surprising how just that simple skill combined with the right questions can make a real impact, positive impact for you, for patients, and the practice.
And on that point, even if they don't then go ahead, that positive experience, they'll say to their friends and their colleagues, actually, I had a really great time. He was really, he understood, he listened, or whatever. Yeah, no, it's a really fascinating one, isn't it? And I think the problem is I'm terrible at it. And I don't know, Justin, you might have seen this. I mean, it's interesting because you're as an outside clinical kind of individual. Dentists want to fix stuff, right?
Yeah.
And we love features. We love gadgets. And I think this really takes us out of our comfort zone, these conversations, because it is about not always fixing and not always finding features to fix. It's much more subtle and human than that. And in our private and professional lives, from a personal point of view, I just want to fix stuff. When my kids come home and they say, I'm upset by this, I say, well, I can fix that. No, that's not what I'm asking. What I'm asking you to do is to say, yeah, I realize you've had a bad day. Let's have some chips.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I mean, is that just me, or do you see that all the time?
I see that a lot. I've experienced that myself a lot. I've had to work on it to change it. Because people don't, as you say, people don't always want an answer. Actually, they just want to have a conversation so they can process their own thinking. it does take some practice, and it takes a change in your perceptions to be able to make that switch or transition. We also have to learn a bit of emotional intelligence so that we can read other people as effectively as possible, so we know actually when someone's waiting for us to give them more information versus when actually we just need to stop, listen, and understand. And that does take a bit of acuity and experience.
Agreed. It's hard. And so, I mean, I'm conscious we're coming towards the top of the hour. There's some really lovely comments in the group there, which is great. I am absolutely certain there's a lot of us are perceiving a need to get more involved with this conversation longer term. So do please take the opportunity to have a little look at Justin's books. I have put the link into the chat there. If you want to, even better, get in touch if you want to learn more and find out more and go on this progression with Justin and benefit from his experience in much more depth. But I'm gonna, if it's okay with you, Justin, give you the final few words and final few moments if you have any kind of final thoughts. Thanks to Caroline for putting this all together. I am delighted that so many of us have managed to get on the call this evening. Nothing beats a slow Wednesday in January, hey? So thank you to all of you for joining us. And thank you most importantly to Justin for giving up your time. And final words, final moments, over to you, sir.
Thanks so much, Guy. Thanks to you, Caroline, the ops management team as well, who I know are great advocates for this program. And I'd love to continue the conversation and to share more about what we can do to hopefully help all of you, those of you who would like to go further on this, to really kind of develop this to skill and hopefully, develop your practices as we go through 2025. So do feel free to contact me directly if you want to, but also, feel free to register your interest with Caroline and we'll circle back with you. And final thing from me, we will get the recording and the slides out to you over the next 24 hours or so. I'll do that through Caroline and ask Caroline to share those resources with you. But huge thanks to everybody for joining us this evening and for your input. Guy, thanks as always for your support. Really appreciate it.
Have a lovely evening, everybody, and keep in touch. This is the starting point. Good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night, everybody. Thank you. Take care. See you soon.